The village of Loch lay draped in silence under a blanket of snow so deep it muffled every sound and turned familiar streets into a shifting, featureless landscape. The cold seemed to seep into the bones, but even so, it was the kind of winter that made the little hamlet look almost picturesque, the kind that would fool a visitor into thinking nothing untoward could ever occur here. Yet on this particular morning, a mystery had arisen that had everyone whispering in stunned, uneasy tones. It began when Mrs. Gilmore, the innkeeper at the Laird's Arms, noticed that one of her regulars, the reclusive art dealer Mr. Jervis, had not emerged from his room since the previous evening. At first, she assumed he had merely slept late or retreated into his customary solitude. But as the hours stretched, a gnawing suspicion took hold, and she had gone to check the door herself. It was locked from the inside. A soft rapping, a polite cough, and the absence of any reply pushed her to peek through the window. Inside, the room appeared ordinary in its cluttered, unkempt fashion. Papers strewn across a desk, a chair knocked over, but there was no sign of Mr. Jervis. No footprints on the snowy balcony outside, no evidence of struggle. The room was precisely as one might leave it after an ordinary night's sleep, except for the peculiar clue that made Mrs. Gilmore's fingers tingle with unease. On the desk, amid the disorder, lay a single pristine snowdrop. The flower was impossible here, frozen months before in the depths of winter, impossible to have survived without warmth. It seemed absurd, almost theatrical in its placement, as though mocking anyone who might try to make sense of it. Word spread quickly, reaching the ears of Hamish Macbeth, Loch-Dew's unassuming constable. Hamish had learned long ago that the village's quiet surface concealed undercurrents of intrigue and human folly. He arrived at the inn with a brisk gait, his mind already cycling through the possibilities. The snow outside crunched beneath his boots, each step a reminder of the isolation that could work both for and against an investigation. Inside, the inn was warm, perfumed faintly with peat smoke and Mrs. Gilmore's anxious energy. He was led to Mr. Jervis's room, and the sight of the locked door and the solitary snowdrop set a puzzle spinning in his mind. The locked room presented itself as the classic conundrum, yet Hamish knew better than to assume the obvious. No sign of forced entry suggested either an intruder had never come or that the room itself was a trap. The scattered papers on the desk were art catalogues, invoices and letters from London galleries, but none offered immediate insight into the snowdrop's presence. Hamish crouched to examine the floor, his eyes tracing the patterns of dust and dirt under the edges of furniture. Even the faintest impression in the snow outside could offer a lead, and yet he found nothing. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing. The absence of evidence was, paradoxically, the first piece of evidence in his mind. He called Mrs. Gilmore closer. "Did Mr. Jervis receive any visitors last night?" he asked, voice calm, deliberate. She shook her head, her hands wringing a dish towel. "Not that I saw. He's been alone more than usual. He writes letters, makes calls, but no one comes in. And he never leaves the room when he's thinking. This morning I thought he'd gone to the market, and then—" Her voice faltered as her gaze fell upon the tiny white flower, a tremor of fear crossing her usually steady features. Hamish let his eyes wander again, noting the meticulous placement of items in the room, the absence of dust on the desk where the snowdrop lay as though someone had set it deliberately. He moved to the window, checking the snow-laden sill and the frozen balcony beyond. There was no disturbance in the fresh snow, no evidence of anyone having entered or exited the room from outside. Even the locks were unbroken, the mechanism unjiggled. It was as if Mr. Jervis had vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but a floral enigma that defied explanation. He stood there, hands on hips, considering the possibilities. Had it been a prank? An elaborate warning? Or something more sinister? The snowdrop was a deliberate choice. Hamish knew that much. It was meant to convey a message, a signature of some kind, but he could not yet read it. The simplicity of the act, the placement of a single flower, belied an underlying complexity that suggested intelligence and precision. Whoever had left it had not rushed, had not feared discovery. They had been confident, almost theatrical, like a playwright placing the final prop before the curtain rose. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and relentless, concealing footprints and erasing evidence. Hamish stepped back, running a hand across his cheek, his mind turning over each detail, each absence. In the quiet, he felt the tug of the unsolvable, the tantalizing lure of a crime that whispered secrets only to those patient enough to listen. And in that silence, he understood the challenge before him. The snow had covered every clue, but somewhere beneath its cold, deceptive blanket, the truth waited, waiting for someone clever or stubborn enough to uncover it. Hamish knew he would find it, even if the path was hidden in layers of snow and misdirection, for Loch Dhu had secrets, and secrets, as always, demanded discovery. Hamish left the inn with the snow crunching under his boots, his breath visible in the cold air, and his mind already turning over what he had seen. The village constable had a way of noticing things that most others overlooked, small details that seemed trivial until they became central to the puzzle. As he walked toward the heart of Loch Dhu, he kept replaying the scene in his mind, the locked room, the scattered papers, and the solitary snowdrop perched deliberately on the desk. It was almost theatrical, but it was also a message, and Hamish was determined to decode it. Returning to the inn, he asked Mrs. Gilmore if he might speak to anyone who had seen Mr. Jervis in the days leading up to his disappearance. She suggested the postman, who made his rounds early in the morning, and the milkman, whose cart had passed the inn every evening. Hamish nodded and made his way to the postman first. He found him by the frozen edge of the river, shoving letters into the local postbox. The man was a wiry, weather-beaten figure, his fingers red and stiff from the cold, and he seemed eager to talk, though his words were cautious. "Mr. Jervis, nothing unusual, I'd say. Letters every day, like clockwork. But the other night he was fidgety, I thought. Kept checking the window like he was expecting someone." The postman shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with his own observation, but to Hamish, the smallest admission could be a thread to follow. Hamish's eyes, sharp and searching, lingered on the man's hands. One finger bore a faint dark smudge, something that looked like soot or perhaps ink. But it was the kind of detail everyone else would dismiss as trivial. Yet Hamish filed it away, knowing that in a locked-room mystery, even minor stains or traces could indicate a hurried note, a hidden letter, or a mislaid object. As the man shuffled away, Hamish noticed the snow around the postbox had been disturbed in a strange, erratic pattern, as if something heavy had been dropped or dragged across it. He knelt and traced the marks, recognizing at once that the pattern was inconsistent with any normal human passage. It hinted at movement in haste, a struggle, or even a deliberate staging. Hamish's next stop was the milkman, whose cart rested in a corner of the village square, frozen in place under the thick snow. The milkman was more nervous than the postman, twitching at every step and muttering under his breath. "Saw Mr. Jervis, on Thursday. He went into the inn late carrying a small parcel. Didn't see him after that. Odd, though. He seemed uneasy." Hamish studied the milkman's reaction closely. The man's eyes flickered toward the inn, and then away, as if trying to avoid the truth he knew but would not speak. Hamish made a mental note. Both witnesses hinted at unease, a tension invisible to the casual observer, but palpable to those trained to read human behaviour. Back at the inn, Hamish's gaze returned to the room itself. He crouched by the desk again, this time examining the papers more closely. Among the jumble, he spotted a small folded scrap of parchment, partially hidden beneath a ledger. It was faintly creased, as if it had been hastily concealed, and bore a smudge of the same dark substance he had noticed on the postman's finger. He carefully unfolded it and saw a few words scrawled in a hurried hand, an address, a date, and a single cryptic line. "The snow keeps secrets." Hamish's mind raced. The snowdrop, the locked room, the uneasy witnesses, they were threads, each pulling him toward an invisible pattern. The clue was not in what was immediately obvious, but in the gaps, the inconsistencies, the things deliberately left for only unperceptive enough to notice. Hamish stood, brushing snow from his coat, his eyes sweeping the room one last time. On the windowsill he noticed something others might have dismissed entirely, a faint smear, as though someone had pressed their hand against the glass and left a partial print. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it told him that someone had been there, outside or inside, and that their presence had been carefully disguised. Every detail he observed, every minor inconsistency, deepened the mystery rather than simplifying it. Yet for Hamish, these were not obstacles, they were signposts, guiding him toward the hidden truth that others could not yet see. The snow might have covered every clue, but the clever eye could find what was buried beneath, and Hamish was already beginning to unravel the threads that would lead him closer to the answer. Hamish left the inn with the scrap of parchment carefully folded in his coat pocket, his mind already turning over the clues he had gathered. The snow outside continued to fall thick and relentless, coating the village in a whiteness that softened edges and blurred details. But it also heightened awareness. Every sound echoed. Every movement became noticeable. He knew that in a village as small as Lochdu, nothing remained hidden for long. Yet everyone had their reasons for hiding pieces of the truth. His next step was to speak with those who had been closest to Mr. Jervis, beginning with the neighbours whose eyes had likely glimpsed more than they realised. He started with Miss Cairns, a seamstress who lived across the lane. Her house was warm with the smell of damp wool and burning peat, and her hands were busy at the window, darning a sock as he entered. She greeted him with a nervous smile. "Hamish, I don't rightly know much, but I thought I heard voices last night. I couldn't see who it was, only muff." Led words through the snow. It sounded like an argument, maybe, or perhaps only my imagination. Hamish noted the hesitancy, the way her eyes darted toward the door, as if measuring her own honesty. Small discrepancies often held more weight than outright statements, and her uncertainty could either be genuine or a carefully constructed shield. Next, he spoke with Mr. Macbeth, the village carpenter, whose workshop smelled of sawdust and varnish. The man seemed eager to speak, almost too eager, as if anxious to be involved in the investigation. "Hamish, I tell ye I saw nothing suspicious, but I did see someone leave the inn late last night. A shadow, quick and careful. Couldn't see who it was, mind, but I'm sure someone went out, even though the door was locked." Hamish watched the man closely, noting the tremor in his voice and the way his fingers drummed against the workbench. Over-eagerness could be as revealing as reticence, and this shadowy account clashed with the evidence of the undisturbed snow outside. Someone was attempting to shape the narrative, and the truth was slipping between the cracks of their statements. The final person Hamish chose to speak with was the village shopkeeper, Mrs. Dunsmore, whose keen eyes had witnessed more than most gave her credit for. She offered a careful, measured recounting. "I saw Mr. Jervis around midday receiving a parcel, small, wrapped plain. He seemed preoccupied checking the street, glancing at the sky as if expecting rain or snow. That was all, I swear." Her words were precise, her tone neutral, but Hamish detected the subtle pause before she mentioned the parcel, as though weighing each word. It suggested something unsaid, a detail she had decided to keep until prompted. As the questioning continued, patterns emerged not in the statements themselves but in their silences and contradictions. Miss Cairns was uncertain yet focused on a vague argument. Mr. Macbeth offered a vivid account that did not align with the snowy exterior. Mrs. Dunsmore presented facts neatly, yet a hesitation hinted at concealed knowledge. Hamish observed that while some villagers spoke freely, others held back just enough to provoke doubt. Every minor deviation, every careful phrasing, every unintended glance or twitch seemed to carry a kernel of truth hidden beneath the surface. He jotted notes discreetly, each observation stored for later synthesis. Returning to the inn, Hamish studied the locked room once more. His mind wove together the threads, the snowdrop, the mysterious parcel, the odd scuffing of snow outside, and now these conflicting testimonies. He began to suspect that deception was layered, with each person revealing only fragments and concealing motives. Why was Macbeth so eager to contribute? Why had Cairns noticed voices but remembered nothing clearly? And what exactly was in that parcel Mrs. Dunsmore had observed? The pieces did not yet fit neatly, but they suggested deliberate misdirection. Someone wanted Hamish to chase shadows, to be led away from the truth that lay hidden in plain sight. Pace the floorboards, noting the way light fell across the desk and how the snowdrop's white petals gleamed against the dark wood. The room itself had become a silent witness, the witnesses outside merely players in a carefully orchestrated play of concealment. Hamish understood that the answers would not come from overt confession, but from discerning the subtle inconsistencies, the suppressed details, and the motives lurking behind polite smiles and nervous glances. The deeper he probed, the more it became clear. The truth was not only buried beneath the snow, but also beneath a network of half-truths and quiet deceptions, and the game had only just begun. Mish spent the late afternoon in. Quiet reflection at the inn, the room growing colder as the snowstorm outside thickened, casting the village into a near-white haze. He could feel the weight of the tangled motives pressing in on him, the way every suspect seemed to carry a plausible reason to act, but left crucial gaps that refused to align. He returned to his notes, laying them side by side. The parcel, the snowdrop, the locked room, the scuffed snow, and the conflicting witness statements. It was like tracing the threads of a tangled net, each pull revealing new intersections and hidden knots. He began with Mr. Mac Cole, the carpenter whose over-eagerness had seemed almost theatrical. Hamish considered the man's circumstances. McColl had recently lost a contract for a major restoration in Inverness, a commission that Jervis had reportedly influenced. That alone would give McColl reason to harbour resentment, perhaps even desperation, but there was no evidence to suggest he had the cunning to orchestrate the disappearance of a man from a locked room. Yet desperation could make someone reckless, and Hamish filed the possibility away, cautious not to dismiss it outright. There was Miss Cairns, whose nervous admission of hearing voices hinted at more than mere imagination. She had long admired Jervis's collection, particularly a rare set of sketches he kept privately. Rumour had it that she had once expressed jealousy over the attention he gave another art dealer from London. Could envy have driven her to act? Hamish noted that while jealousy could provide a motive, the means remained unclear. Miss Cairns was gentle, timid, someone unlikely to confront another directly, and certainly not to engineer the complexities of a locked-room disappearance. Still, Hamish kept the detail in mind. Jealousy often left subtle fingerprints in the choices one made. Mr. Dunsmore, the shopkeeper, remained perhaps the M.O. St. Enigmatic. Her measured recounting of events hinted at awareness she had yet to disclose. Hamish considered what she might gain from Jervis's absence. She had invested in a small venture with him, a speculative purchase of rare prints that had recently soured. Fear of financial loss could drive quiet manipulation, a desire to control the narrative, or perhaps an attempt to divert suspicion. Her knowledge of the parcel suggested she had seen more than she admitted, and in the village's tight-knit ecosystem, she had the means to influence others' perceptions subtly. A puppet master, hidden in plain sight. Hamish's eyes drifted back to the locked room, and he traced the pattern of minor inconsistencies he had observed, the snow undisturbed, the precise placement of the snowdrop, the faint smear on the windowsill. Each detail hinted at someone meticulous, deliberate, and careful. If this had been a crime of impulse, greed, envy, fear, it had been masked by calculated planning. The motives of the villagers intersected like a lattice, but the means required precision. Hamish began to consider that perhaps the person responsible was leveraging the other's motives, creating a smokescreen of opportunity and distraction. He mapped the connections in his mind: Mac Cole's resentment, Cairns's envy, Dunsmore's fear of loss. Each played into the other's potential actions, whether intentionally or inadvertently. It was a web in which everyone had a thread, but no single thread alone could explain the complexity of the events. And then there was the parcel, the small, unassuming object that seemed to have acted as a trigger or a message. Its contents remained unknown, yet Hamish sensed it held significance beyond mere correspondence. Perhaps it was the catalyst for the plan, the spark that set the delicate machinery of motives into motion. Hamish's thoughts returned to the snowdrop, pristine and deliberate in its placement. Its symbolic nature struck him: purity, secrecy, and an almost mocking suggestion that someone was watching, waiting for the right mind to notice. Whoever orchestrated this disappearance had understood human behavior. exploiting desires, fears, and jealousies carefully, threading each suspect's motives into a larger, opaque design. The room felt colder still, the shadows lengthening as evening fell, and Hamish realized the investigation would require patience, observation, and a willingness to peer behind every polite denial and hesitant admission. By the time he stepped outside, the snow had settled in heavier drifts, the village silent under its white weight. Hamish walked slowly back toward the inn, tracing steps in the fresh snow, pondering the intricate puzzle of intertwined motives. Each suspect was both a potential witness and a potential actor, every alibi a fragile construct that might crumble under careful scrutiny. The maze of reasons was vast, yet Hamish felt the edges beginning to reveal themselves. Somewhere within this lattice of desire, fear, and resentment lay the truth of Mr. Jervis's disappearance, a truth hidden beneath layers of snow, secrecy, and deception, waiting for the sharpest eye to uncover it. The morning after his long walk through the snow, Hamish returned to the inn to check the room once more. The storm had eased overnight, leaving the village crisp and almost unnaturally quiet. As he entered, he noticed that the innkeeper, Mrs. Gilmore, seemed unusually animated. Word had already spread. The authorities had found a clue they claimed would solve the mystery. A small parcel, apparently dropped behind the inn in the night, had been retrieved and was now being presented as a breakthrough. Inside it was a letter addressed to Mr. Jervis, hinting at a dispute with a local tradesman, Mac Cole, the carpenter, whose earlier eagerness had now been taken as guilt. Hamish observed the scene quietly. The constables bustled about, exchanging triumphant glances, ready to close the case and congratulate themselves on their cleverness. Mr. Mac Cole, for his part, appeared flustered yet relieved, as though the accusations simultaneously terrified and vindicated him. "It proves nothing," Hamish muttered under his breath, carefully examining the parcel and its contents. The handwriting was peculiar, but he noted immediately that it lacked the careful construction one would expect from someone attempting to hide their involvement. It almost seemed planted. Too obvious, too tidy, as if it had been left precisely so the authorities would find it and declare the mystery solved. Despite the outward appearance of progress, Hamish's instincts pricked. He scrutinized Mac Cole's manner, the nervous twitch in his hands, the way his eyes flickered when anyone mentioned the locked room. There was unease, but not the genuine panic of someone cornered. This felt rehearsed, as though he were playing a part scripted by someone else. The snowdrop flashed in Hamish's memory, pristine and deliberate, a symbol that the true architect of events was still beyond view. The real puzzle had not yet begun to yield its answers. Hamish turned his attention to the letter itself, noting subtle anomalies. Certain phrases were archaic, almost theatrical, not the casual vernacular of a tradesman angry over a business slight. The letter's tone suggested knowledge of Mr. Jervis's habits, movements, and private affairs, knowledge that Mac Cole could not possibly possess without inside information. Hamish's gaze fell on the smudge in the corner, faint but familiar, the same dark substance he had previously noticed on the postman's finger and on the hidden scrap of parchment in the room. It was a signature of sorts, a connecting thread that the authorities had overlooked in their rush to judgment. The constables, oblivious to the subtle irregularities, were already drafting statements, eager to report the resolution to Inverness. Mrs. Gilmore hovered anxiously, glancing between Hamish and the officers, uncertain whether he would support their conclusion. Hamish nodded politely to her but did not speak, his mind working through every detail. He considered the parcel, the letter, and the behaviour of Mac Cole. The evidence aligned too perfectly, too conveniently. Someone had orchestrated the appearance of resolution, knowing that the village authorities would be eager to claim victory. The real culprit remained hidden, watching, waiting for the opportunity to act again. Hamish stepped outside into the snow to gather his thoughts. The village looked peaceful, the rooftops sparkling in morning light, but the calm was deceptive. He noted tracks in the fresh snow near the back of the inn, faint impressions leading to the edge of the frozen river. They were too deliberate to be accidental, too precise to be random. Someone had moved carefully in the night, leaving hints for those perceptive enough to notice. The letter and the parcel were decoys, a false narrative designed to mislead. while the true movements of the culprit remained obscured in the labyrinth of snow and secrecy. Returning to the inn, Hamish observed Macbeth again. The man seemed relieved, even proud, to be vindicated in the eyes of the authorities. Yet Hamish detected a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps even fear, that the whole story had not yet been revealed. The constables, consumed by their own sense of accomplishment, failed to notice the signs that the puzzle was far from complete. Hamish's intuition whispered insistently that the locked room, the snowdrop, the hidden parcel, and the carefully staged letter were all pie. CES of a far more intricate plan, one that required patience, cunning, and subtle manipulation. As he lingered in the inn, Hamish realized that the game had shifted. The authorities were content to celebrate an illusion of closure, while the true perpetrator remained in the shadows, patient and calculating. The snow outside, heavy and concealing, would continue to hide the tracks of the real criminal until the precise moment when the pieces were ready to move. Hamish understood that he alone would have to navigate the layers of deception, peel back the false victories, and wait for the subtle cues that would finally reveal the person behind the carefully constructed illusion. The real challenge had only just begun, and he was ready to follow the trail wherever it led, however deep it might disappear beneath the snow. Hamish spent the afternoon poring over the village records at the tiny Lochdu registry office, the fire in the grate crackling softly as he traced names and dates with careful precision. The false resolution of the previous day had left the authorities smug and complacent, but Hamish had long since learned that the simplest explanations were rarely the correct ones. His eyes scanned old police reports, village council minutes, and dusty ledgers that recorded past disputes and debts. He knew that sometimes the key to a present mystery lay buried in forgotten quarrels, the long-forgotten grudges that simmered quietly beneath the surface of polite society. It was in a report from nearly 15 years earlier that something caught his attention. A small dispute between Mr. Jervis and a local collector had escalated, ending in a minor scandal. Threats exchanged, tempers flaring, and accusations of forgery. At the time, the authorities had considered it a closed matter, yet the names he saw resonated. Mrs. Dunsmore, then a young shop assistant, had been involved. Peripherally, handling payments and correspondence, Macbeth, barely out of apprenticeship, had worked on a refurbishment of the collector's property. Even Miss Cairns had been present at a local auction, witnessing the heated exchanges that erupted. The connections were subtle, almost incidental, yet together they formed a network that suggested the current events were not born solely of present circumstances. Hamish closed the ledger and leaned back, considering the implications. The snowdrop, the locked room, the planted letter. They could not simply be about a recent quarrel or business dispute. This was layered, rooted in years of accumulated grievances, resentments, and half-forgotten rivalries. Perhaps someone had waited, gathering fragments of old slights, watching opportunities present themselves, before orchestrating a scenario so meticulous that it could mislead both witnesses and the authorities. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. This was not an impulsive act, but one carefully plotted over time, with each participant, knowingly or unknowingly, cast in a role designed by a mind attuned to patience and subtle manipulation. He retraced his steps mentally, Macbeth's eagerness, Cairns's nervous glances, Dunsmore's careful hesitations. In the context of this past dispute, their behaviours took on new shades. Macbeth's resentment was not merely over a lost contract, it was a continuation of old humiliation, a grievance reignited. Cairns's jealousy was layered over years of perceived slights and unacknowledged admiration. And Mrs. Dunsmore, whose quiet precision had masked deeper involvement, now appeared as someone intimately aware of the subtle dynamics that had been playing out for decades. Each suspect was no longer isolated, they were part of an intricate web, their present actions shaped by unresolved conflicts that had long predated the snow cover. D streets. Hamish returned to the inn, retracing the path along which he had first examined the locked room. The snow crunched underfoot, fresh drifts partially obscuring footprints from the day before. In the silence, he allowed himself a moment to consider the psychological dimension. Someone who could manipulate not only the physical evidence but also the human responses must have known the village intimately, understood the subtle interplay of fear, desire, and obligation. The snowdrop, a symbol so delicately chosen, now seemed even more pointed, a reminder that the present puzzle was inseparable from the past. As he entered the room, Hamish's gaze fell upon the small, folded parchment and the letter from Mac Cole. Comparing the handwriting with older correspondence from Mrs. Dunsmore and archived letters from Mr. Jervis, a faint stylistic echo emerged. Certain phrases, certain careful constructions, echoed patterns seen years ago. It was subtle, easy to dismiss, yet consistent with a mind accustomed to hiding messages in plain sight, a signature recognizable only to someone who knew where to look. The threads of past and present intertwined, and Hamish felt the faint thrill of progress, the first hint that the invisible architect of this mystery had a pattern, one that could be followed, if only he were patient enough to trace it fully. Outside, the snow began to shift with a gentle wind, sculpting drifts against the eaves and smoothing over tracks. Hamish stepped onto the cold stone steps and surveyed the quiet village, each house a potential repository of memory, each resident a living link to the past. The case was no longer merely a puzzle of the present. It was a story written across years, hidden in the overlapping motives, resentments, and secrets of those who had lived through old grievances. Somewhere within this lattice of history and human foibles lay the key to understanding the disappearance of Mr. Jervis. The past had returned, masked in snow and secrecy, demanding that Hamish follow its silent, winding path to the truth. Hamish returned to the inn that evening, the fading light casting long shadows across the snow-laden streets. The village seemed asleep under its white blanket, yet inside the warm glow of the laird's arms, tension lingered thick as smoke. The authorities had retreated into a comfortable belief that the case was solved, their earlier triumph now a settled certainty. But Hamish knew better. The threads he had traced, the old grievances, the planted letter, the parcel, the snowdrop, pointed to a deeper orchestration. He needed to see beyond what was visible, to unsettle the carefully constructed facades of the suspects, and to observe how each reacted when confronted with subtle, probing challenges. He decided on an unconventional approach. Instead of direct questioning, he would employ a test of character, a method he had often used with remarkable subtlety. He would stage a small ruse, observing not just words but reactions, hesitations, and involuntary gestures. He placed the snowdrop in a different, yet conspicuous position on the desk, alongside the folded scrap of parchment, and then invited the three main suspects, McColl, Cairns, and Dunsmore, into the room, one at a time, under the guise of casual conversation about minor village matters. Hamish's tone was light, almost dismissive, but he watched for micro-reactions, the almost imperceptible flickers that might betray knowledge beyond what they admitted. McColl entered first, the firelight catching the worried lines on his face. Hamish spoke about the old auction, and casually mentioned the parcel, watching as the carpenter's eyes flickered involuntarily toward the snowdrop now lying askew. A small twitch at the corner of his mouth, a slight shift. In stance, nothing overt, yet enough to suggest that he recognized the item as more than mere decoration. Hamish allowed the moment to linger before moving to Cairns. She entered, her steps tentative, hands clasped, eyes scanning the room with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Hamish casually referred to the letters and the previous day's breakthrough. She stiffened, and then, almost imperceptibly, her fingers brushed the edge of the parchment. The movement was subtle, defensive, a reflexive gesture that revealed she understood the document's significance far more than she admitted. Finally, Mrs. Dunsmore arrived, her expression carefully neutral. Hamish mentioned the old dispute from years ago, speaking as though he were musing aloud, not probing. Her hands tightened around the small cloth she carried, the only outward sign of unease. He let his gaze linger, speaking calmly about hypothetical motives, threading into the conversation casual references to greed, envy, and fear. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed the briefest hesitation, the split-second flicker of someone balancing the knowledge of secrets she hoped to keep hidden. Hamish noted every subtle shift, every micro-expression, understanding that the human instinct to conceal often revealed far more than words could convey. After the three had left, Hamish returned to the desk, studying the snowdrop and the parchment once more. He considered the reactions he had observed. Each suspect had revealed a subtle crack in their deception, a trace of knowledge beyond what they had confessed. The snowdrop, so innocuous yet symbolically potent, had served as a psychological catalyst, provoking instinctive reactions that could not easily be masked. The scrap of parchment, previously dismissed as a minor clue, now took on renewed importance as a focal point that linked memory, motive, and opportunity in ways that mere observation of actions alone had not revealed. The strategy had worked because it bypassed the conscious defenses each person had built, targeting reflexive behavior rather than reasoned response. Hamish understood that deception rarely survives direct, skillful observation. Even the most careful liar leaves traces in micro-movements, glances, or gestures. Tonight, the cracks had appeared, subtle yet undeniable, and the puzzle began to yield its secrets in ways that mere evidence had not. As he closed the inn door behind him and stepped back into the cold, snow-dusted evening, Hamish felt a renewed surge of clarity. The case was shifting from a maze of possible motives and planted evidence toward a pattern he could follow. The true orchestrator was no longer entirely hidden. The psychological breadcrumbs had begun to lead him in a discernible direction. Somewhere within the village, beneath layers of politeness, fear, and long-held grudges, the person who had set these events in motion waited, unaware that Hamish's keen eye had already begun to trace the invisible thread connecting past to present, deception to truth. The snow continued to fall silently, but for the first time Hamish sensed the outlines of a path through it, faint yet undeniable, leading toward the revelation that would finally untangle the web. The following morning, Hamish arrived at the inn before anyone else, the pale winter light casting long muted shadows across the snow-drifted village. Inside, he moved directly to Mr. Jervis's room, where the snowdrop still lay on the desk, and the scrap of parchment rested beside it. He carefully examined both once again, cross-referencing his notes and mentally arranging the timeline. The subtle reactions from Mac Cole, Cairns, and Dunsmore had given him the first real threads to follow, and for the first time he felt he was close to understanding the web of deception. Yet, as he bent to examine the scrap once more, he froze. Parchment was gone. In its place, a faint smear of the same dark substance he had seen before marked the desk, a smudge that seemed almost deliberately theatrical. Hamish's eyes narrowed. The letter had vanished, not misplaced, not accidentally dropped, but deliberately removed. Whoever had taken it knew its significance, and they had acted quickly, leaving only the ghost of their presence. He ran a gloved hand over the desk, careful not to disturb any additional traces. Whoever had been in the room last night had left a deliberate message in its absence. Stop now, or the truth would vanish entirely. Hamish considered the possibilities. Could it have been one of the suspects? The parcel, the staged letter, and the reactions during his psychological test suggested a mind that was patient, calculating, and intimately familiar with the village. Someone had the cunning to manipulate perceptions, planting false evidence to mislead, and now they had escalated, removing the one item that had started to reveal the pattern beneath the deception. The realization sharpened his instincts. This was no ordinary disappearance. The perpetrator was actively controlling the narrative, moving unseen, leaving only carefully measured clues for the observant. He returned immediately to the innkeeper. "Mrs. Gilmore," he said, his voice calm but firm, "who entered this room after yesterday morning?" She shook her head, frowning. "No one, Constable. Not that I know of. I locked it when I left. The keys are in my drawer." Hamish studied her, noting the hesitation in her eyes, but the truth did not lie here. The smudge on the desk indicated someone had handled the evidence with care, deliberately, perhaps with gloves. And yet there was a small, telltale trace that suggested familiarity with both the room and the daily habits of the inn. Hamish filed the observation away. Someone within or close to the village had moved the evidence to obscure it. Outside, he traced the perimeter of the building, scanning the snow for disturbances. The wind had partially erased footprints, but there were faint impressions near the back window, patterns that suggested a deliberate entry and exit that avoided obvious paths. The vanishing of the parchment was not just a theft, it was a warning. a signal that the perpetrator remained vigilant, watching each step of the investigation and willing to intervene to maintain control. Hamish felt the tension coil tighter. Every move he made now could be anticipated, and every action by the authorities could be manipulated. Trust had become fragile, almost illusory. The villagers, the witnesses, even the constables were now potential unwitting instruments in the orchestrator's plan. Returning to the inn, Hamish considered the implications for his investigation. The stolen parchment contained the subtle connections between the suspects, the reactions, and the old grievances he had uncovered. Its absence disrupted the linear path he had begun to trace, forcing him to rely on memory, observation, and deduction rather than written evidence. Yet, Hamish's mind worked quickly, reconstructing the scrap's contents from the details he had already memorized. The phrases, the symbols, the barely perceptible marks that link the present events to the shadows of the past. If he could preserve the continuity of thought, he could still uncover the truth, even without the physical document. The realization sharpened his focus. The perpetrator was not merely clever, they were audacious, confident that the village's frozen streets and the snow-covered inn would shield them from detection. But Hamish understood that such precision could also betray a weakness. Those who moved meticulously often left patterns, however faint, that could be traced by someone observant enough. He resolved to rebuild the chain of evidence in his mind, to test each suspect's reactions, and to anticipate the next move. The stakes had risen. The disappearance of Mr. Jervis was no longer just a locked-room mystery or a tangle of motives. It was now a game of control, a battle between deception and perception, and Hamish knew he would need every ounce of his experience and intuition to navigate it. The snow outside continued to fall, thick and concealing, yet beneath it, footprints. Some visible, some only in the mind's eye, were beginning to lead him toward the shadow who had dared to manipulate both evidence and expectation. Hamish had barely begun to reconstruct the stolen parchment in his mind when a sharp, urgent knock at the inn's door jolted him from his thoughts. Breathless and anxious, Mrs. Gilmore ushered in Constable Forbes, whose face was pale beneath the brim of his cap. "Hamish, it's bad. Mr. Macbeth, he's missing." The words struck like a sudden gust of wind, scattering any calm Hamish had maintained. The carpenter, last seen only hours ago, had vanished from his workshop on the edge of the village, leaving only a tipped-over chair and scattered tools, a scene almost too neat in its chaos to be accidental. Hamish's mind leapt into motion, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into urgent, tense alignment. He grabbed his coat, the snow outside already forming thick, wind-blown drifts across the frozen streets. The workshop lay just beyond the row of cottages, its wooden facade dark against the grey light of morning. Inside, it was apparent that someone had been there recently. The small tools lay in disarray, but there were no footprints leading away, only faint impressions near the back door, partially obscured by a fresh dusting of snow. Hamish crouched, examining the marks. They suggested deliberate manipulation, not a hasty escape. Whoever had taken Macbeth had done so with precision, likely aware that Hamish was following a trail, anticipating the next moves of the investigation. He traced the impressions toward the back of the workshop. Hamish noticed an unfamiliar object partially buried in snow, a small, ornate button, glinting silver under the weak daylight. It was clearly part of someone's coat, its placement odd, almost taunting in its visibility. Hamish picked it up carefully, tucking it into his pocket. The button, alone, was insufficient to identify a perpetrator, but it was a signature, a breadcrumb, proof that the orchestrator of these events was still several steps ahead, watching, waiting, and confident in their ability to manipulate the village and the investigation simultaneously. Returning briefly to the inn, Hamish reviewed the connections he had observed. The missing Macbeth was no longer merely a suspect. He was now a potential victim, or, worse, a pawn in a larger scheme. The earlier disappearance of the parchment and the carefully staged letter had been warnings, but this sudden vanishing, escalated the danger. The orchestrator was no longer content to manipulate evidence alone. They were acting in real time. capable of violence or abduction, proving that Hamish's next steps had to be cautious, strategic, and precise. Hamish decided to visit Mrs. Dunsmore, who ran her shop near the village square. She had always been precise and deliberate, and he suspected that the new crime would be connected to her knowledge or observation. When he entered, he found her unusually distracted, glancing toward the back door as though expecting someone. Hamish asked about Mac Cole's movements, casually referencing the previous day's events and the old grievances. She hesitated, a brief tightening around her mouth betraying her composure. He went to check on a delivery constable. I thought he returned before the snow set in, but perhaps... Her voice trailed, the uncertainty genuine or carefully feigned. Hamish filed the moment away, understanding that subtle cracks in demeanour often revealed far more than words. Mid-morning, the atmosphere in Lochdu was tense. Villagers whispered behind closed doors, the wind sweeping snow across the streets as if to conceal the growing unease. Hamish returned to the inn, thinking through the sequence of events, the disappearance of the letter, the reactions to his psychological test, and now Mac Cole's vanishing. Each action, deliberate or staged, suggested a mind several steps ahead, orchestrating both clues and misdirection, forcing the detective to chase shadows while the real criminal remained hidden. The stakes had risen. The investigation was no longer about solving a past act, but preventing further harm, anticipating moves in a deadly game he could not yet see the full board of. Hamish's eyes, sharp and calculating, swept the snow-dusted village streets. Somewhere beyond the drifting flakes, the orchestrator was still at work, patient, cunning, and dangerously confident, and Hamish knew that the next move might demand both courage and guile in equal measure. Hamish returned to the inn late that afternoon, the sky already bruised with the muted purples and greys of a winter evening. The snow had settled into hard, crisp drifts, smoothing over footprints and erasing traces of passage, as if the village itself was conspiring to conceal the truth. Yet, as he stepped into Mr. Jervis's room, he felt the familiar thrill of approaching clarity. The subtle, nearly invisible threads of the case were beginning to align, and a small detail he had long overlooked now glimmered with significance. He crouched beside the desk, eyes tracing the familiar objects, the snowdrop, still delicate and pristine, the spot where the scrap of parchment had lain, now conspicuously empty, and the folded letter retrieved the previous day. For weeks he had catalogued reactions, contradictions, and behaviours, yet one detail had seemed trivial at the time. A faint trace of coal dust on the edge of the windowsill, almost imperceptible, and the peculiar way Mrs. Dunsmore had brushed her sleeve each time the topic of old disputes arose. It had seemed inconsequential, an absent-minded gesture, until he recalled the silver button he had found near Mac Cole's work, its surface lightly tarnished but containing a tiny fleck of the same substance. Suddenly, the connections snapped into focus. The dust, the button, the subtle nervous ticks. They all pointed towards someone accustomed to moving unnoticed, someone intimate with the village's routines and capable of blending work and deception seamlessly. Hamish paced slowly, replaying the sequence in his mind. The stolen letter had not been random. It had been removed to disrupt the reconstruction of old motives. The parcel had been placed to mislead. Mac Cole's disappearance staged to escalate urgency and draw attention away from the true orchestrator. And now, the faint smudges and minor traces, the almost invisible coal dust, the misplaced button, told a story of deliberate, measured manipulation. The villain had left a signature that only a keen eye could trace, a pattern in plain sight that everyone else had dismissed. Hamish's pulse quickened. The chaos of events was no longer random but a carefully choreographed sequence, and the pieces had begun to fall into order. Barrah. He thought of the witnesses' reactions too. Miss Cairns's nervous brushing of the parchment, Mac Cole's slight flinches at innocuous questions, and Mrs. Dunsmore's precise hesitations now made sense, as part of a subtle dance orchestrated to conceal the villain's movements. Each micro-expression had been a brushstroke in a larger picture, one painted not on paper, but in behaviour and misdirection. The snowdrop, once a cryptic symbol, was a signal to Hamish, a visual anchor around which the web of deception revolved. Its placement was deliberate, linking past grievances with present actions, marking the path that led toward the manipulator. Mish moved to the window, considering the tracks in the snow outside. The wind had softened most impressions, but here and there were anomalies, tiny depressions, faint and irregular, betraying someone who moved with care, retracing steps, testing the environment, and erasing traces only selectively. The same habits appeared in multiple locations, near the inn, the workshop, and the lane behind Dunsmore's shop. The pattern was not in a single clue, but in the repetition of small, seemingly innocuous details. A smear of dust, a casual glance, a careful placement of objects. Each act had been deliberate, part of a sequence intended to distract and delay, yet now, viewed together, they formed a path toward understanding the villain's mind. As Hamish leaned back, the realization solidified. The key to the case had been under his nose all along. The truth lay not in the dramatic moments, the disappearance of the letter, McCall's vanishing, or the staged letter, but in the subtle consistencies, the overlooked habits, and the small signs of careful orchestration. He could almost see the pattern mapped across the village, linking past and present, behavior and motive, object and gesture. The threads that had seemed isolated were in fact deliberate, each one echoing the villain's meticulous planning. Hamish felt the surge of certainty that comes only when chaos begins to yield to order. The game was still dangerous, and the perpetrator remained steps ahead, but the outline of their strategy was now visible, and with it, the path toward unmasking the one who had so cleverly manipulated the snow-covered village. Hamish spent the evening by the fire in the inn, the glow of the flames flickering against the walls and casting long shadows across the room. The pattern he had discerned earlier pulsed in his mind with a clarity he had not felt since his earliest cases. The snowdrop, the vanished parchment, the misplaced button, and the subtle smudges of coal dust all connected, but they were not the end of the story. There was something more, something beneath the M. Motives he had already traced, something that explained the audacity and precision of the orchestrator. He knew now that what had driven these events was not mere greed or petty revenge. It was far more personal, far more consuming. He reviewed each suspect in his mind, considering not just what they had done but what they had observed, what they had concealed. Mrs. Dunsmore's careful hesitation, the micro-expressions of Cairns, McCall's nervous energy, all pointed to someone manipulating emotions and actions to conceal a deeper hidden purpose. And then it struck him. The letters, the parcels, the meticulous staging, they were not meant to mislead merely for the sake of evasion. They were intended to provoke reactions, to recreate scenarios from the past, to draw out guilt and fear. The orchestrator was seeking something far beyond money or influence. They wanted confession, recognition, and above all, control over the narrative of their own grievance. E focused on the old records, the dispute from 15 years ago, and the quiet interactions that had followed. The threads led inevitably to Mrs. Dunsmore. She'd been close to the events of the past scandal, intimately aware of the subtle humiliations and injustices suffered by those involved, yet outwardly obedient to village norms. In her mind, the village's failure to acknowledge the wrongs had festered into an obsession. The disappearance of Mr. Jervis was not about inheritance, contract disputes, or envy. It was about rectifying a perceived imbalance, righting a wrong that no one else had recognized, and forcing acknowledgement from those who had ignored the subtle injustices for years. Her actions were extreme, yet in her mind they were justified, a meticulous, almost ritualistic balancing of scales that had gone unobserved for decades. Hamish leaned back, recalling the silver button, the coal smudge, and the rie. Shons he had observed during his subtle tests. Each tiny signature, each carefully staged clue, reflected an individual consumed by obsession, a mind that measured human behavior as though life itself were an experiment. Mrs. Dunsmore had not simply removed evidence, she had orchestrated the narrative to ensure that each person acted in accordance with her vision of justice, that each emotion and hesitation was aligned with her carefully constructed plan. The meticulousness of her orchestration, the deliberate psychological manipulations, revealed a mindset both brilliant and unnervingly cold. a mind that could manipulate the present while referencing the past, ensuring that the long-forgotten grievances became tangible consequences. Even the snowdrop, once thought a whimsical symbol, now made sense in this light. Its delicate placement, visible yet innocent, was a statement. A silent emblem of her own perspective, purity, hidden truths, and the fragility of human perception. Each subtle clue she had left was designed not only to confuse and mislead, but to provoke reflection, to force Hamish and the village to see what she perceived as truth buried under layers of time and indifference. Her motive was not crime in the ordinary sense. It was psychological reclamation, a methodical reenactment of history to assert control and, in her mind, to achieve moral balance. Hamish felt the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. The danger was no longer merely physical, it was cerebral. The criminal he faced was not someone acting impulsively, but someone whose intellect and emotional intensity had transformed a past grievance into a calculated series of events designed to manipulate every observer. Each action, each missing letter, each staged object was a testament to a mind consumed by the need to impose narrative upon chaos. The extremity of her measures, the disappear. Ants, the planted clues, the careful observation of reactions, now made chilling sense. Mrs. Dunsmore had created not only a crime, but a psychological landscape, and only by understanding her motives in their full depth could Hamish hope to anticipate the next move and bring the orchestrator to account. The fire crackled softly, and Hamish sat in silence, tracing the mental map of her scheme. The hidden motive was revealed at last, and it was more shocking than simple greed or vengeance. It was obsession, meticulously executed, rooted in a desire to rewrite the past through manipulation of the present. And now, armed with this understanding, Hamish knew he had the key to ending the web of deception before another life was ensnared in it. Hamish left the fire lit in just as the last glow of daylight faded, the village streets wrapped in a deep hush under the thick blanket of snow. Every step he took was deliberate, each crunch beneath his boots a reminder that the world had been transformed into a muted arena, perfectly suited for the final act he intended to stage. He had spent days tracing subtle patterns, reconstructing motives, and observing micro-reactions. Now, with the hidden drive behind the crime revealed, he felt confident enough to draw the orchestrator into a confrontation of his own design. He made his way to Mrs. Dunsmore's shop, ostensibly to discuss inventory, knowing she would expect a routine visit. The bell above the door tinkled softly as he entered, the familiar scent of parchment and wax greeting him. Mrs. Dunsmore looked up from her ledger, eyes wary, a polite smile masking the tension he knew simmered beneath. Hamish greeted her with his usual calm, conversational tone, remarking casually on the snow, the village, even Mr. Mac Cole's safe return the day prior. Yet each word was carefully chosen, each pause calculated to elicit subtle reactions. As the conversation drifted, Hamish shifted the discussion to the past disputes, speaking almost idly, noting every flicker of expression, every twitch of muscle. He mentioned the silver button found at the workshop and the coal dust traces, framing them as mere curiosities rather than evidence. His subtle pressure was designed to allow the orchestrator's own psychology to betray itself, to reveal the depth of obsession that had driven every staged clue, disappearance, and manipulation. He watched her hands tighten over the cloth she always carried, her eyes narrowing in a flicker of irritation or fear. He could not yet tell which. Hamish then made his move. He leaned forward slightly, speaking softly but with unwavering confidence. "Mrs. Dunsmore, you have orchestrated quite a series of events. The letters, the parcels, the disappearance. It all points back to you. I understand why you did it. The grievances, the injustices you felt went unnoticed. But you've gone too far. Someone might have been hurt, or worse." He allowed the words to linger, letting the weight of acknowledgement settle over her, measuring her reactions, carefully. Her composure wavered almost imperceptibly. She looked down at the counter, fingers twisting the cloth, a flush rising in her cheeks. Then, in a sudden, almost desperate movement, she reached for the door, clearly intending to flee. Hamish moved swiftly, calmly, but with precision, stepping to block her path. "There's no need for that," he said quietly, his tone composed, controlled. I have all the pieces, and running will not change the truth. I can help you, if you are willing to admit what has been done." For a tense moment she hesitated, caught between the compulsion to escape and the understanding that the web she had woven was fully visible to the detective who had observed every nuance, every micro-expression, and every pattern she had left behind. Her hands shook slightly, the cloth slipping from her fingers onto the floor. You understand it," she whispered, almost in awe and fear. "You see why I had to do it. They never understood. I had to make them see." Her voice trailed off, thick with the weight of years of suppressed grievance and obsessive planning. Hamish nodded, keeping his own composure immaculate. "Yes, I understand. But now it must end. No one else should be hurt, and the truth must come to light." Her eyes met his, filled with a mixture of defiance and resignation. The tension in the room, once taut and almost suffocating, began to ease slightly as she realized that the carefully orchestrated manipulations and the psychological traps she had relied upon were now fully exposed. Finally she exhaled, shoulders slumping in surrender. "All of it. Every step. I thought it was the only way," she admitted, her voice low and trembling. Hamish listened, silent and composed, knowing that the confessions and explanations would fill in every detail he needed, allowing him to reconstruct the full sequence and understand the mind that had engineered the snow-covered deception. Outside, the wind rattled lightly against the window panes, stirring the snow in gentle swirls. Inside, Hamish maintained a calm presence, the culmination of careful observation, patience, and insight, as the orchestrator of the chaos finally faced the truth of her actions. The village of Lochduve, silent and blanketed in white, seemed to exhale with him, as though even the snow itself had waited patiently for this final revelation to occur. Hamish left Mrs. Dunsmore's shop with a sense of cautious relief. The confession had clarified the motive, the sequence of manipulations, and the psychological precision behind the disappearance of Mr. Jervis and the staged incidents. The snow outside glistened under the faint glow of lanterns, and the village, for the first time in weeks, seemed to breathe with a quiet expectation that the nightmare had ended. Yet as he walked back to the inn, instinct tugged at him with a familiar, uneasy pull. Something about the entire orchestration still felt incomplete. Returning to the inn, he found Constable Forbes waiting, unusually tense. "Hamish," he said, voice low and urgent, "you'd better see this." He led Hamish to the inn's small office, where a package had arrived, addressed to him in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Hamish carefully opened it, revealing a folded photograph of the snowdrop lying in Mr. Jervis's room, accompanied by a second, even more unsettling image. A hand, gloved in dark leather, placing an object in the snow outside Dunsmore's shop. There was no signature, no note, just the images. The meticulousness of the photographer suggested some. One who had been watching, analysing and recording every step of Hamish's progress. A chill ran down his spine. Mrs. Dunsmore had confessed, but these photographs implied a second layer. Someone else had been orchestrating events, guiding or manipulating her actions from the shadows. Hamish examined the photos again. The gloved hand was unfamiliar, the movements deliberate. Whoever had sent them was communicating not with words, but with proof of surveillance and subtle warnings. They were still in control. The crime, he realized, had not been fully resolved. The confession had clarified motive, yes, but it had only scratched the surface of the full design. Hamish recalled small anomalies he had dismissed during the investigation, a fleeting reflection in the window when Dunsmore had seemed alone, the brief hesitation in Miss Cairns's statements that had never fully aligned with Dunsmore's story, and the offhand remark by Mac Cole that someone had been oddly helpful in directing him toward innocuous tasks during the orchestrated events. Pieces that had seemed minor, trivial even, now shimmered with potential significance. Someone else had been subtly steering events from behind the scenes, ensuring that each suspect acted as a piece of a larger, hidden strategy. But he began to piece together a theory. The true mastermind had remained unseen, using Mrs. Dunsmore as the visible agent of chaos while manipulating the entire village, subtly through observation, suggestion, and psychological nudges. Perhaps they had been the one to steal the letter, leave the coal dust, or even place the snowdrop. Carefully calculating the responses of those around them to craft the illusion of disorder. The confession had satisfied the authorities' need for closure, but Hamish knew the real hand behind the orchestration had never been caught, never exposed. But Amish's eyes swept the room, noting every detail: the lantern on the desk, the pattern of footprints outside, the folds in the parchment now returned. He realized that the photographs had been timed, captured during moments when Dunsmore had been alone, or when her actions were predictable, indicating an intimate understanding of her routines. The final twist was clear and unnerving. The case was far from closed, and the true puppeteer, someone patient, brilliant, and still at large, had deliberately staged events to reveal themselves only indirectly, testing Hamish's acuity and patience at every step. The detective's mind worked quickly, recalling the sequence of reactions, movements, and subtle cues he had observed in each suspect. He understood now that the real test had never been identifying the immediate culprit. It had been anticipating the genius behind the curtain, someone whose understanding of human behavior and manipulation had orchestrated the entire tableau from the shadows. Hamish felt the familiar surge of focus, the clarity that came when the full complexity of a case emerged. The village, silent and blanketed in snow, seemed to wait with him. The last-minute twist had arrived, and the true challenge was no longer merely solving a crime, but uncovering the elusive hand that had shaped every step of the investigation. He knew that patience, observation, and careful reasoning would be essential. The game had changed, the final move had not yet been made, and the shadow that had guided the chaos was still watching, still planning, and still confident in their ability to stay one step ahead. Hamish's eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the room, tracing patterns invisible to others, ready to follow the subtle threads that would finally reveal the mind behind the snow-covered labyrinth. The true resolution, he understood, had only just begun. Hamish spent the night reviewing the sequence of TEs, laying each subtle clue, each reaction, and each misdirection across a mental map. The snow fell steadily outside, muffling the village in quiet white, yet within his mind the threads of deception and manipulation were sharp and precise. The photographs, the gloved hand, the missing letter, and the snowdrop, all were now understood as deliberate elements of a far-reaching design. It was a game of shadows, and he had spent days tracing their movements, aware that the real mastermind was still out there, watching, testing, and confident in their ability to remain unseen. At first light, Hamish returned to the workshop where Mac Cole had been taken. He retraced the steps, noting the small depressions in the snow, the subtle disturbances that he alone seemed to see. Following the trail led him to a narrow lane behind the village, where a faint impression in the snow suggested someone had been moving with care, retracing their steps, cautious but precise. Hamish crouched, examining a small smear of coal dust, identical to that found in Dunsmore's shop and on the earlier letter. This was no coincidence. Whoever had left it understood the pattern he was now following, and the deliberate placement confirmed that the final act was about to unfold. Hamish paused, considering the subtle misdirections that had thrown the authorities off course. The stolen letter had drawn attention, Mac Cole's disappearance had escalated urgency, and the staged reactions of witnesses had created the illusion of a single orchestrator. In truth, there were two layers: Mrs. Dunsmore, whose obsession had driven much of the visible manipulation, and the hidden mastermind, who had been quietly directing events, ensuring that Hamish and the village would follow false trails while the true plan remained intact. The final revelation had been foreshadowed in small, seemingly inconsequential details: the raffle, action in the shop window, the way Miss Cairns's eyes lingered on certain objects, and the unusual timing of the parcels. Hamish pressed forward along the lane, mindful of each sound and shadow. The faint footprints led him to a small abandoned storage shed at the edge of the forest, snow piled against its weathered walls. Inside, he found the gloved hand again, this time still placed deliberately atop a small pile of letters and photographs. Mrs. Dunsmore's accomplice, the true mastermind, had left a final message, evidence of their omnipresence and control, as if to say the game had been played perfectly. The realization settled over Hamish like frost. Justice could be delivered for Mrs. Dunsmore, but the ultimate orchestrator had escaped, leaving only traces behind, an invisible hand that had shaped events without ever being caught. Hamish gathered the letters, photographs, and the small silver button, understanding their significance in context. Returning to the village, he explained to the assembled authorities how each minor detail, every coal smudge, every micro-expression, every misaligned object, had pointed to the existence of a second, hidden layer of manipulation. Mrs. Dunsmore acted out of obsession, he said calmly, but she was not alone. The true architect remained in the shadows, ensuring that all of our observations and assumptions were guided toward false conclusions. The snowdrop, the letters, the staged reactions, they were all part of a carefully orchestrated psychological pattern. The constables listened, nodding, yet there was an unspoken tension. The knowledge that someone had outsmarted them, had used the village itself as part of an elaborate trap. Hamish, standing firm, continued, "Justice has been served in the visible crimes. Mrs. Dunsmore will answer for her actions. But the person who manipulated her, who guided the entire sequence, has escaped. They left only the smallest traces, enough for a keen eye to detect but not enough to capture." As the snow fell outside, blanketing Loch Dhu in serene silence, Hamish allowed himself a moment of reflection. The village seemed safe, the immediate danger resolved, yet a subtle unease lingered, like a shadow at the edge of vision. The mastermind had vanished, leaving behind their meticulous signature, a final lesson in patience, observation, and human psychology. Hamish understood that some games were never fully concluded, that genius and obsession could slip through the net of justice. Yet in that quiet, frost-tinged morning, he also knew that the invisible threads had been exposed, that the patterns of deception had been traced, and that for now the village could breathe. Justice had been served for those actions that could be punished, and the hidden genius, though escaped, had revealed their own mind to the one person capable of understanding it. Hamish stepped out into the snow, the village silent and glimmering beneath the pale sun, knowing that even when justice is incomplete, clarity and insight remain the ultimate triumph of a detective's work. Hamish left the village square, just as the sun dipped behind distant hills, casting a pale golden light across the snow-covered rooftops. The village of Loch Dhu had returned to a fragile calm. Mrs. Dunsmore was in custody, her obsession now documented, her confession recorded, and the immediate danger resolved. Yet as Hamish walked through the narrow lanes, the crunch of snow beneath his boots was a quiet reminder that the resolution was only partial. The true mastermind remained unseen, an enigma hidden behind deliberate gestures and carefully orchestrated misdirection, and the traces they had left lingered in his mind like ghostly fingerprints on glass. He paused at the edge of the village, where the forest began, and glanced back toward the inn. The soft glow of lanterns illuminated the windows, and inside, life carried on as though nothing had occurred. Villagers tending fires, sharing tea, exchanging cautious words. Yet Hamish's gaze lingered on the small details that others never noticed. The faint smudge of coal dust still clinging to a threshold, the slight unevenness of a shutter that had been adjusted in haste, and the lingering impression of footsteps leading nowhere. Each of these minor anomalies hummed with significance, reminders that while the visible crime had been resolved, a subtle narrative continued just out of reach. He remembered the photograph, the gloved hand, and the way it had been deliberately positioned to convey power, control, and observation. Who had sent it? What had been the message behind it? Mrs. Dunsmore had been a willing actor in her own obsession, but the person who had manipulated her, who had guided the chaos from the shadows, was still at large. Hamish knew that some crimes were never truly closed, and that certain minds moved in ways that defied simple capture. He had traced patterns, uncovered motives, and mapped psychological signatures, but the lingering presence of the unseen orchestrator was a puzzle left unsolved, a final, tantalizing whisper of the complexity, hidden beneath human behavior. Hamish continued along the snow-drifted lane toward the forest edge, the silence around him deep and absolute. A branch snapped softly under his hand as he pushed through, and he froze, listening. There was no answer, only the whisper of wind over frozen boughs, and yet he could not shake the sensation that the game was not fully concluded. Perhaps a detail had slipped past him, a micro-reaction he had dismissed too easily, or a deliberate hint left by the unseen manipulator to provoke curiosity, to signal that the puzzle was far from over. The thought was unsettling, yet it energized him. A good detective never rested fully until every Dow had been examined. As he emerged into a small clearing beyond the village, Hamish surveyed the quiet expanse of snow and pine. The wind carried faint, almost imperceptible impressions, small disturbances in the snow that suggested passage careful and intentional, leaving no clear trace but enough for a keen eye to detect. He crouched, examining the patterns, noting how each irregularity could be a message, a sign, or perhaps a test left by someone still observing from afar. The snowdrop, the letters, the gloved hand, all had been part of an elaborate choreography. Who had designed the final steps? And why? Hamish rose, brushing snow from his coat, and allowed a faint wry smile to cross his face. Some mysteries, he mused, were never meant to be fully tamed. They existed to test patience, perception, and intellect, to remind even the most vigilant that human behaviour, obsession, and genius could leave questions that lingered long after the apparent conclusion. Loch Dhu would settle into its usual rhythm, the immediate threat gone, yet somewhere, beyond the village's borders, a mind capable of precise calculation and psychological manipulation still watched, leaving threads for Hamish to follow the next time the snow concealed more than it revealed. Turning back toward the village, Hamish's steps were steady, his breath visible in the crisp air. He carried with him the satisfaction of having untangled what could be resolved, yet the thrill of the unknown lingered. The snow-covered streets of Loch Dhu glittered in the fading light, serene and deceptive, a perfect stage for the next subtle game that would demand his attention. And as the wind whispered through the trees, Hamish knew one thing for certain. In Loch Dhu, mysteries never truly ended. They only awaited the keen eye willing to follow the faintest trail through the snow.